The morning of April 18, 1943, broke over the Solomon Sea with a haze that hung low across the water, like breath on glass. Major John Mitchell checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes, fighting the drowsiness that came from flying at wave-top height for over 2 hours. 50 feet below his Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the Pacific rolled in endless swells, each crest threatening to swallow the twin-boomed fighter if his concentration slipped for even a second. Behind him, stretched in a loose formation barely visible through the salt spray, 15 more Lightnings hummed through the moisture-laden air, their contra-rotating propellers cutting parallel paths through a sky the Japanese believed was theirs alone. Mitchell's navigation had been executed by dead reckoning. Compass headings, airspeed calculations, and a wristwatch. No radar, no radio beacons, just mathematics and faith across 600 miles of open ocean, following a circuitous route designed to keep them invisible to Japanese coastal watchers. The mission was simple in its audacity. Intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, and eliminate him from the war. But simplicity in conception had demanded perfection in execution, and perfection had demanded the only American fighter capable of flying this distance, fighting and returning home, the P-38 Lightning. The aircraft German pilots had laughed at when they first encountered its ungainly twin-boom silhouette over North Africa, the fighter that Luftwaffe veterans dismissed as too big, too slow, too strange to pose a real threat. Yet here it was, about to execute the longest fighter interception mission in history, striking 400 miles from its base with surgical precision. At 9:34 in the morning, exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, Mitchell spotted them. 2 dark shapes materialized through the haze at 6,000 feet. Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. 6 Zero fighters flew escort, unaware that below them, climbing now with throttles shoved to the firewall, 16 American pilots were about to shatter the myth of Japanese invulnerability in their own backyard. The very aircraft the Germans had mocked for its twin engines, its unconventional design, its supposed clumsiness, was about to change the course of the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how the P-38 Lightning came to be flying over Bougainville that morning, and why its presence there represented such a profound reversal of expectations, one must return to the late 1930s, when the United States Army Air Corps confronted an uncomfortable truth. The fighters in its inventory were obsolete. The Curtiss P-36 Hawk, the service's primary pursuit aircraft, could barely exceed 300 miles per hour in level flight. The Boeing P-26 Peashooter, still in frontline service, was an open-cockpit biplane design that looked more at home in the skies of 1918 than 1938. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Germans were fielding the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and intelligence reports suggested the British were developing something called the Spitfire. The Americans needed to catch up, and quickly. In February 1937, the Army Air Corps issued a specification that bordered on fantasy. They wanted a twin-engine interceptor capable of reaching an altitude of 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. It needed a top speed of at least 360 miles per hour at that altitude. It required heavy armament, heavy enough to destroy an enemy bomber with a single pass. And it needed to climb rapidly enough to intercept high-altitude threats before they could reach their targets. The specifications were so demanding that many established aircraft manufacturers dismissed them as unachievable. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation was not an established fighter manufacturer. The company, based in Burbank, California, had built its reputation on passenger aircraft and long-range transports. But Chief Engineer Hall Hibbard and his young assistant, Clarence Kelly Johnson, saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. Johnson, just 33 years old, had already made his name by solving aerodynamic problems that had stumped older engineers. He looked at the Army's requirements and made a calculation that would define the P-38's entire existence. No single American engine then available could meet those performance demands. The only solution was to use two. This decision, forced by the limits of contemporary power plant technology, would become the source of both the P-38's greatest capabilities and its harshest criticisms. Johnson and Hibbard designed an aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. Instead of a conventional fuselage, the P-38 featured two Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled engines mounted in streamlined nacelles. These nacelles extended rearward into long tail booms that connected to a horizontal stabilizer and twin vertical stabilizers. The pilot sat in a central pod positioned between the engine nacelles, with all armament concentrated in the nose of that pod. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns and a 20-millimeter Hispano cannon. The guns did not converge from wing mounts as in other fighters. They fired straight ahead in a concentrated stream, every tracer and every bullet aimed at the same point. The engine nacelles housed more than just the Allisons. Each contained a General Electric turbocharger mounted atop the engine, enabling the P-38 to maintain power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. The turbochargers were revolutionary technology, but they came with a price: complexity. The Allison engines required careful management of throttle settings, propeller pitch, and mixture controls. The turbochargers needed precise adjustment to avoid overboosting at altitude. And the counter-rotating propellers. The left engine turned its propeller clockwise as viewed from the cockpit. The right engine counterclockwise. Eliminated torque effects but demanded that pilots think differently about engine-out procedures. On January 27, 1939, Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey, the Army Air Corps test pilot assigned to the P-38 project, lifted the prototype XP-38 into the California sky for its maiden flight. The aircraft performed beyond expectations. It was fast, faster than anything else in the American inventory. It climbed rapidly. The concentrated armament promised devastating firepower. Kelsey and Johnson were elated. 2 weeks later, seeking to demonstrate the XP-38's capabilities to a skeptical Congress, Kelsey attempted a transcontinental speed record flight from California to New York. He made it across the country in 7 hours and 2 minutes, shattering the previous record. But on his final approach to Mitchell Field on Long Island, carburetor icing robbed both engines of power. The prototype crashed short of the runway. Kelsey walked away from the wreckage. The Army Air Corps, having seen what the P-38 could do, ordered 13 service test aircraft despite losing the prototype. By June 1941, the first production P-38's were rolling off Lockheed's assembly line. They were magnificent machines on paper, 400 miles per hour maximum speed, a service ceiling above 40,000 feet, range exceeding 1,100 miles. But paper specifications and combat reality were about to collide in ways that would test both the aircraft and the men who flew it. The P-38 entered American service at a moment of global crisis. In Europe, the Battle of Britain had demonstrated that air superiority could determine the fate of nations. In the Pacific, Japanese expansion was accelerating, though the United States remained officially neutral. The Army Air Corps, soon to be redesignated the Army Air Forces, began training pilots on the Lightning, as the British had christened it, maintaining Lockheed's tradition of naming aircraft after mythological figures. Early training revealed the aircraft's demanding nature. The P-38 required more time to master than single-engine fighters. Pilots had to learn to manage 2 engines, 2 propellers, and 2 sets of controls. They had to understand the peculiarities of the Allison power plants, which ran hot in tropical climates and cold at altitude. They had to adapt to an aircraft that handled differently than anything they had flown before. Then came December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the United States was at war with Japan. Within days, Germany declared war on America. The P-38, still in the early stages of deployment, suddenly became a critical asset. The Army Air Forces rushed Lightnings to the West Coast, fearing Japanese attacks on California. Other squadrons deployed to the Aleutian Islands, where the P-38's ability to operate in brutal cold proved valuable. But most of the early production went to Europe and North Africa, where American forces were preparing to confront the Luftwaffe. It was in North Africa, in the autumn of 1942, that German pilots first encountered the P-38 in combat. Their initial reaction was dismissive, even mocking. Luftwaffe pilots had been trained on sleek, nimble single-engine fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. These aircraft represented the pinnacle of German fighter design. Compact, agile, optimized for the brutal turning dogfights that characterized air combat over Europe. The P-38, by contrast, looked wrong. Its twin-boom configuration seemed ungainly. Its size, a wingspan of 52 feet, length of 37 feet 10 inches, made it appear cumbersome. And those twin engines. To German pilots schooled in the doctrine of the lightweight single-engine interceptor, the P-38's design seemed to violate fundamental principles of fighter aviation. Twin-engine fighters had a reputation, and it was not a good one. They were slower to roll. They were less maneuverable. They were vulnerable to attacks from below, where the twin booms created blind spots. The Luftwaffe itself had experimented with twin-engine fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-110, and while capable in certain roles, they were generally outclassed by nimble single-engine opponents in dogfights. When Luftwaffe pilots first spotted P-38s over Tunisia, many assumed they were reconnaissance aircraft, too bulky to be frontline fighters. That assumption proved costly. The first engagements quickly demonstrated that the P-38 was no reconnaissance plane and no easy target. Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 77 in North Africa, encountered the Lightning in combat and came away with grudging respect. The unit's Bf-109s were perhaps a little faster than the P-38, he admitted, but engaging one in a dogfight was daunting. The Lightning's turning radius was much smaller than expected. It could reverse direction with alarming speed, and if a German pilot made the mistake of attacking head-on, he faced not wing-mounted guns with converging fire patterns, but a concentrated stream of 50-caliber rounds and 20-millimeter shells coming straight down the Lightning's nose, all aimed at the same point. Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace who would survive the war with 28 confirmed kills, flew Bf-109s against P-38s over North Africa. Years later, he would recall the experience with clarity. The Lightning could turn inside the 109 with ease, he said. It could transition from level flight to a climb almost instantaneously, using power and flaps in ways that defied German expectations. Luftwaffe pilots learned a cardinal rule: never fight a P-38 head-on. The concentrated firepower was simply too devastating. Even experienced German pilots who could win turning contests against Spitfires and Thunderbolts found themselves outmaneuvered by Lightnings flown by competent American pilots. The mockery began to fade, replaced by wariness. Within 6 months of the P-38's deployment to North Africa, a lone German pilot surrendered to Allied forces near Tunisia in a state of near hysteria. He had been shot down and was found pointing at the sky, repeating a single phrase over and over: Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. When Allied intelligence officers translated the phrase, they realized the P-38 had acquired a new nickname among Luftwaffe pilots, one spoken not with contempt but with fear. Yet the Lightning's reputation in Europe remained mixed, and for reasons that had little to do with its fundamental design. The P-38's twin Allison engines, superb in the warm climates of the Pacific and North Africa, struggled in the frigid high altitudes over Germany. At 25,000 feet and above, where American bombers flew their deep penetration raids into the Reich, temperatures could drop to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. The Allison engines, lacking the sophisticated cooling systems of later models, would sometimes fail at critical moments. Cockpit heating was inadequate in early versions, leaving pilots shivering and fatigued during long escort missions, and the aircraft suffered from a problem that would not be fully understood until later: compressibility. The P-38 was one of the first American fighters to routinely operate at speeds and altitudes where the airflow over its wings approached the speed of sound. At high altitude, in a steep dive, pilots discovered that the Lightning's controls would suddenly lock up. The shock waves forming over the wings created a condition where moving the control yoke had no effect. Pilots found themselves unable to pull out of dives, their aircraft accelerating toward the earth while they pulled uselessly on unresponsive controls. Some managed to dive below the critical altitude where the problem disappeared. Others did not. The phenomenon baffled engineers until wind tunnel tests revealed the truth. The center of pressure was moving rearward on the wing at transonic speeds, creating forces beyond the pilot's ability to overcome. Kelly Johnson, ever the problem solver, designed electrically powered dive flaps that would deploy beneath the wings, disrupting the shockwave formation and allowing pilots to regain control. But these fixes took time to develop and implement. Meanwhile, in the skies over Germany in 1943 and early 1944, P-38's took losses escorting heavy bombers. The missions exposed the Lightning to the full fury of Luftwaffe resistance, Bf-109s and FW-190s flown by experienced pilots who had learned to exploit the P-38's high-altitude weaknesses. The Lightning could fight at lower altitudes, where its power and maneuverability shone. But bomber escort demanded high-altitude performance, and there the early models struggled. By mid-1944, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its superb high-altitude performance, long range, and better cold-weather reliability, began to displace the Lightning from the bomber escort role over Europe. The P-38 found itself relegated increasingly to ground attack and reconnaissance missions in the European theater. It performed these roles admirably, but the aircraft's reputation never quite recovered from the difficult early months over Germany. American pilots in Europe developed a saying: the P-38 was a great airplane for the Pacific. And in the Pacific it was. While the Lightning struggled over Germany, it dominated in the Southwest Pacific. The same characteristics that created challenges in one theater became advantages in another. The twin engines that were finicky in frigid European skies ran reliably in tropical heat. The long range that was merely adequate for escorting bombers to Berlin became extraordinary for the vast distances of the Pacific island chains. The twin-engine safety margin, if one engine failed, the Lightning could limp home on the other, was invaluable over thousands of miles of empty ocean. And the concentrated nose armament, devastating against lightly armored Japanese aircraft, made the P-38 a formidable killer in the hands of skilled pilots. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, could not get enough P-38s. He lobbied Washington relentlessly for more Lightnings, even as the European theater received priority. When one squadron, the 39th Fighter Squadron of the 35th Fighter Group, Arrived in his theater in November 1942 equipped with P-38's, Kenny immediately put them into action. On December 27, 1942, the Lightnings proved their worth over Dobodura, an advanced Allied base in New Guinea. About 60 Japanese aircraft, Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers, Mitsubishi A-6M Zero fighters, and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, struck the base in a late-morning raid. Allied coast watchers, the network of observers scattered across Pacific islands, had provided early warning. The 39th Fighter Squadron scrambled its Lightnings, a mix of P-38F and P-38G models, led by two men who would become legends, Captain Thomas Lynch and Lieutenant Richard Bong. The Japanese formation, confident in its numerical superiority, did not expect serious opposition. What they encountered was the concentrated firepower of the P-38. Lynch's Lightning literally chopped one Oscar in half with a burst from its 4 50-caliber machine guns and 20-millimeter cannon. The American pilots claimed 11 kills in the engagement. While Japanese records later indicated only 3 losses, a common discrepancy in air combat claims, the message was clear. The Lightning could outgun the light Japanese aircraft with devastating effect. The P-38's advantages in the Pacific stemmed from the nature of the theater itself. Pacific air combat occurred at lower altitudes than European fighting, where the Lightning's maneuverability was at its peak. Japanese fighters like the Zero and Oscar were lightly built, optimized for agility, but vulnerable to the P-38's heavy firepower. A burst of 50-caliber fire that might only damage a German fighter's armor and self-sealing fuel tanks would rip through a Zero's unarmored structure like paper. Moreover, the distances involved in Pacific operations made the P-38's range not just useful but essential. Missions of 500, 600, even 700 miles were routine. No other fighter in the American inventory could fly those distances, fight, and return. The twin engines provided psychological comfort as well as practical safety. Pacific fighter pilots knew that an engine failure over the ocean meant almost certain death in a single-engine aircraft. The ocean was vast, shark-infested, and largely empty of rescue resources. In a P-38, an engine failure meant an anxious flight home on one engine, burning fuel carefully, but it meant a flight home nonetheless. Pilots reported that the steady rumble of 2 Allisons was a reassuring sound over all that water, a redundancy that turned what would have been a death sentence into merely an emergency. By early 1943, the P-38 had become the dominant American fighter in the Southwest Pacific. American aces were beginning to accumulate impressive scores flying Lightnings. Dick Bong, the quiet young pilot from Wisconsin, would eventually reach 40 confirmed kills, all in P-38's, making him America's highest-scoring ace of the war. Thomas McGuire, flying in the same theater, would reach 38 victories before his death in combat in January 1945. Both men credited the P-38's design for enabling their success. The stability provided by the twin engines, the accuracy of nose-mounted guns, the power to engage and disengage on their terms. It was against this background, the P-38's proven capabilities in the Pacific, its growing reputation as a long-range hunter, and its unique suitability for extreme-distance missions, that American intelligence officers in Hawaii opened a decoded Japanese message on the morning of April 14, 1943. The message, intercepted by 3 separate stations of the magic code-breaking apparatus and decrypted by Navy cryptographers, contained information that would change the course of the war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the man many Americans blamed for initiating the Pacific War, was planning an inspection tour of Japanese bases in the Solomon Islands, and the message contained his precise itinerary, down to the minute. The decrypted message was almost too good to be true. It specified that on April 18th, Yamamoto would depart Rabaul, the massive Japanese base on New Britain, at 600 hours local time. He would fly to Balal Airfield near Bougainville in 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by fighters. He would arrive at 0800 hours. The Admiral was known for punctuality. He would be on time. The message even specified which bases he would visit and how long he would spend at each. Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, saw the implications immediately. He rushed the decrypt to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz read it, looked up, and asked a single question. "Do we try to get him?" The question was not simple. Attempting to intercept Yamamoto would risk revealing that American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval ciphers. If the Japanese suspected their codes were compromised, they would change them, potentially blinding Allied intelligence at a critical phase of the war. Some intelligence officials in Britain, who had not suffered Pearl Harbor personally, argued vociferously against the operation. They believed that no single admiral, however important, was worth risking the code-breaking advantage that had already helped win the Battle of Midway. But the decision was not Britain's to make. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox reportedly held a midnight meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. Whether Roosevelt actually uttered the words often attributed to him, "Get Yamamoto," remains a matter of historical debate. No written order exists, but the authorization came down through the chain of command. Nimitz passed the order to Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces. Halsey, who had commanded carriers at the time of Pearl Harbor and who harbored personal hatred for Yamamoto, did not hesitate. He drafted the order himself. Squadron 339 P-38 must, at all costs, reach and destroy. The President attaches extreme importance to the mission. The mission planning fell to Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of air operations in the Solomons. Mitcher consulted with Army Air Forces officers because the Navy's carrier-based fighters did not have the range to reach Bougainville from Guadalcanal. The F-4F Wildcat and F-4U Corsair fighters based on the island could not make the round-trip journey and fight. There was only one American fighter in the theater capable of the mission, the P-38 Lightning. 3 P-38 squadrons were based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The 12th, 70th, and 339th Fighter Squadrons. The 339th, commanded by Major John Mitchell, had recently received a full complement of P-38G models and was chosen to lead the mission. Mitchell, 31 years old, was an experienced pilot and a careful planner. When Mitcher and Halsey summoned him on the afternoon of April 17th and revealed the target, Mitchell understood immediately both the opportunity and the challenge. The challenge was distance. Balale Airfield was 350 miles northwest of Henderson Field as the crow flies. But flying a straight line would take the P-38's over Japanese-held islands, where coastal watchers and radar stations would almost certainly detect them and alert Yamamoto's escort. To achieve surprise, Mitchell would have to fly a circuitous route, swinging far out to sea to avoid detection. When he and Mitcher's staff plotted the course, measuring carefully on maps, the outbound leg came to 600 miles. The return trip, which could be flown more directly once surprise was lost, would be about 400 miles. Total mission distance, 1,000 miles. 1,000 miles in a fighter aircraft in 1943 was not merely long, it was unprecedented. The P-38G's standard internal fuel capacity was 410 gallons. At combat power settings, that fuel would burn in under 3 hours, not nearly enough for a 5-hour mission that included sustained low-altitude flight and high-intensity combat. The solution was drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat began. Each P-38 would carry 2 drop tanks, one standard 165-gallon tank and one oversized 330-gallon tank. The asymmetric configuration was necessary because the P-38's hard-point locations limited the size of tanks that could be mounted. The total fuel load, including internal and external tanks, would be over 900 gallons per aircraft. Mitchell spent a sleepless night calculating fuel consumption rates, plotting courses, and working out timing. Every detail mattered. The P-38's would have to fly the outbound leg at low altitude, below 50 feet above the ocean, to stay beneath Japanese radar coverage. Low-altitude flight consumed fuel faster than high-altitude cruise. The route would take them southwest from Guadalcanal, following a dogleg course that would bring them up along the western coast of Bougainville, where the interception would occur. Navigation would have to be perfect. Mitchell would navigate by dead reckoning, compass headings, airspeed calculations, and time checks. 1 degree of error in heading over 600 miles would put them miles off course, and they had to arrive precisely on time. Too early, and Yamamoto would not yet have arrived. Too late, and he would have landed, surrounded by hundreds of Japanese troops and fighters at Balao. 18 pilots were selected for the mission. 16 would fly the actual attack. 2 would serve as spares in case any of the primary aircraft developed mechanical problems during the flight. The 16 were divided into 2 groups: a killer flight of 4 P-38's, whose specific mission was to shoot down Yamamoto's bomber, and a cover flight of 12 P-38's, whose job was to intercept and engage the Japanese fighter, escort, keeping them off the killer flight's backs. The 4 pilots in the killer flight were Captain Thomas Lanphier, Jr., First Lieutenant Rex Barber, First Lieutenant Jim McClanahan, and First Lieutenant Joe Moore. The planning required secrecy so absolute that Mitchell did not tell the pilots their specific target until the final briefing. He told them only that they were going after an important high-ranking officer on an inspection tour. Some of the pilots guessed they were hunting Yamamoto. Others thought perhaps they were after a general or air commander. Mitchell emphasized the navigation challenge and the fuel constraints. They would fly at wave-top level for over 2 hours. They could not afford even 1 minute of wasteful maneuvering. When they reached the interception point, they would have perhaps 10 minutes of combat time at full power before they had to break off and head for home, or they would run out of fuel over the ocean. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. At 7:25 on the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38, lightnings rolled down the runway at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and lifted into the tropical sky. Each aircraft carried its asymmetric load of drop tanks, making the planes feel nose-heavy and unwieldy during the initial climb. Mitchell led the formation with the killer flight, Lanphier, Barber, and their 2 spares directly behind him, and the cover flight fanning out in loose formation. 2 of the 18 aircraft developed mechanical problems shortly after takeoff. Lieutenant Joe Moore's P-38 lost one of its drop tanks, and he had to abort. The spare pilot, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, moved up to take Moore's place in the killer flight. The formation turned northwest and began a shallow descent toward the ocean. Within minutes, they were flying at 50 feet above the water, close enough that the propeller wash from the lead aircraft kicked up spray that misted the windscreens of the following planes. The sound was tremendous. 36 Allison engines running at cruise power, the slipstream howling past canopies, the steady thrum of ammunition belts and hydraulic systems. Inside their cramped cockpits, the pilots settled into the peculiar mixture of boredom and tension that characterizes long-distance flight, constantly scanning instruments, checking fuel consumption against calculated rates, adjusting throttles and mixture controls to maximize endurance while maintaining formation. Mitchell flew by compass, heading, and watch, with no radio navigation aids and no landmarks over the featureless ocean. Every 10 minutes, he would check his calculations. Distance flown, fuel remaining, estimated time to target. The math was unforgiving. If he misjudged their ground speed by even 5 miles per hour over the course of 2 hours, they would arrive at the wrong place. If a headwind had slowed them more than expected, they might arrive too late. If they had a tailwind and arrived too early, they might have to circle, burning precious fuel, or might even miss Yamamoto entirely. The pilots tried not to think about sharks. The ocean below them teemed with them. If an engine failed this far from land, and engine failures were not uncommon with temperamental Allison engines, ditching in the ocean would be the only option. The P-38 was not designed for water landings. The nose-heavy configuration, the twin engines ahead of the center of gravity, the long booms extending behind, all of it meant the aircraft would likely flip or nose under immediately upon hitting the water. Even if a pilot survived the impact, the likelihood of rescue this far from any Allied base was virtually zero. But the lightnings droned on, hour after hour. Pilots shifted in their seats, trying to ease the cramping that came from holding formation in rough air. They watched their fuel gauges, mentally calculating whether they had enough to reach the target, fight, and return. And Mitchell, fighting exhaustion and the hypnotic effect of staring at endless water, continued his dead-reckoning navigation, trusting mathematics and skill to bring them to a point in the sky at precisely the right moment. At 9:33, 2 hours and 8 minutes after takeoff, the island of Bougainville appeared as a dark smudge on the horizon. Mitchell checked his watch. They were 1 minute ahead of schedule. Perfect. He began a gentle climb, bringing the formation up to 5,000 feet as they approached the western coast of the island. His eyes swept the sky ahead, searching for the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese bombers. The intelligence had said Yamamoto would arrive at 0800. Allowing for the time zone difference and the Admiral's known punctuality, that meant the Japanese formation should be visible now. And there they were. At 9:34, exactly on time, 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers appeared through the light haze at 6,500 feet, flying in loose formation toward Balal Airfield. 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters flew escort, split into 2 V formations, positioned at the bombers 4 o'clock and 1,500 feet higher. The Japanese were confident enough that they had not maintained tight defensive formation. They were minutes from landing at a base they controlled, surrounded by friendly territory, convinced no American fighters could possibly reach this far from Allied bases. Mitchell's hand moved to the radio transmit button, but he held back. Radio silence had been absolute for over 2 hours. Breaking it now might alert the Japanese. Instead, he rocked his wings, the signal to jettison drop tanks. 18 P-38's released their external fuel tanks almost simultaneously, the heavy cylinders tumbling away toward the ocean below. The lightnings, suddenly lighter and cleaner aerodynamically, accelerated as the pilots shoved throttles forward to maximum power. The cover flight banked right, positioning themselves between the incoming Japanese formation and the expected swarm of Zeros from Kahili Airfield on southern Bougainville. Mitchell had anticipated 50 to 75 Zeros rising to defend Yamamoto. The Japanese had stationed 75 Zero fighters at Kahili. Surely they would scramble everything they had to protect their commander. But no massive fighter formation appeared. The Japanese, operating in what they believed was secure airspace, had sent only 6 Zeros to escort the 2 bombers. It was a catastrophic underestimation born of supreme confidence. The Americans were supposed to be 400 miles away, unable to reach this far. The idea that enemy fighters could appear over Bougainville was simply not in Japanese tactical calculations that morning. The killer flight, now reduced to 3 aircraft after the earlier abort with Lanfear, Barber, and the spare Holmes, broke left and dove toward the 2 Betty bombers. The Japanese spotted them almost immediately. The Zero escorts dropped their own external tanks and dove to intercept, but they were 1,500 feet above and behind the attacking P-38's. The geometry was bad for the Japanese. The Lightnings had speed, position, and the advantage of surprise. What happened in the next 90 seconds would be debated for decades, with different pilots claiming credit for the kill that mattered most. What is certain is this: Captain Thomas Lanfear turned to engage the diving Zeros head-on, a desperate maneuver to buy time for his wingmen. His P-38 climbed toward the descending Japanese fighters, forcing them to break off their attack run. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Rex Barber, flying in a borrowed P-38 nicknamed Miss Virginia, locked onto the 2 Betty bombers as they frantically dove toward the jungle canopy, seeking the protection of treetop level. The Betty bombers were large, twin-engine aircraft designed for range, not maneuverability. The Mitsubishi G4M had earned a grim nickname among Allied pilots, the Flying Lighter. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it extraordinarily vulnerable to gunfire. A few well-placed rounds could turn it into a fireball. As the first Betty dove toward the jungle, Barber closed to within 100 yards, point-blank range by fighter combat standards, and opened fire. The P-38's concentrated nose armament delivered approximately 100 rounds per second when all guns fired together. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20-millimeter cannon poured a stream of metal into the Betty's right engine and rear fuselage. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The right engine exploded in flames. Black smoke poured from the fuselage. The bomber rolled violently to the left, trailing fire. Barber pulled up sharply to avoid collision, then looked back to see a column of black smoke rising from the jungle. Betty had crashed into the trees. Barber did not know which bomber carried Yamamoto, neither did any of the American pilots. The intelligence had specified 2 Bettys, but not which one held the Admiral. Banking hard, Barber searched for the second bomber. He found it low over the water off Moila Point, desperately trying to evade the remaining P-38's. This Betty carried Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, along with other members of the Admiral's staff. Barber and the other Lightnings converged on it, their combined firepower ripping into the bomber's structure. The pilot lost control. The Betty smashed into the ocean at full speed, breaking apart on impact. Above them, the air battle raged. The 6 Zero escorts, realizing too late what was happening, engaged the American fighters in a swirling dogfight. The Zeros were nimble and dangerous, but they were outnumbered nearly 3-1, and the P-38 pilots had altitude and energy advantage. One P-38, flown by Lieutenant Raymond Hine, was shot down during the engagement, the pilot listed as missing in action. But the Zeros could not prevent the destruction of both bombers, and within minutes, the surviving Japanese fighters disengaged and fled toward Kahili. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes. Mitchell, watching his fuel gauges and knowing they were pushing the margins of safety, called for the formation to turn southeast and head for home. The P-38's, some damaged by Zero gunfire, others nearly out of fuel, began the long flight back to Guadalcanal. Behind them, smoke rose from 2 crash sites, one in the jungle of Bougainville, one in the ocean off the coast. The P-38 that made an emergency landing in the Russell Islands due to battle damage and fuel exhaustion, eventually made it home. The rest of the formation landed at Henderson Field between 11:45 and noon, having been airborne for more than 4 hours. Several aircraft rolled to a stop with their fuel gauges reading empty, their engines coughing as the last drops of fuel were consumed. Mitchell's navigation had been so precise that they arrived within 1 minute of his calculated time. Not 1 minute had been wasted. Not 1 gallon of fuel had been squandered. It had been, as one historian would later write, a supreme example of pilot skill. On Bougainville, a Japanese search and rescue party led by Army Engineer Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Hamasuna located the crash site of the first Betty bomber on the morning of April 19th. They found the wreckage deep in the jungle, about 9 miles from the town of Panguna. The aircraft had plowed through the trees at high speed, scattering debris across hundreds of yards. But one section of the fuselage remained relatively intact. Inside that section, still strapped in his seat, they found Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The admiral had been thrown clear of the main wreckage, but remained seated, his white-gloved hand still grasping the hilt of his katana sword. His head was tilted forward, as if in contemplation. Hamasuna reported that Yamamoto was instantly recognizable despite the violence of the crash. The medical officer who examined the body found 2 bullet wounds. One had struck the admiral in the back of his left shoulder. The other had entered his left lower jaw and exited above his right eye. The head wound, the doctor determined, had killed him instantly. Yamamoto had died in the air, struck by rounds from Rex Barber's P-38, before Betty even hit the jungle. The American military leadership initially kept the mission's success secret. The concern about compromising the code-breaking effort was real and immediate. If the Japanese suspected their codes had been broken, they would change cipher systems, potentially blinding American intelligence at a critical phase of the war. The official announcement was carefully worded to suggest that the interception had been a lucky encounter, not a planned assassination. But within weeks, details began to leak. An unauthorized account appeared in Time magazine in May, mentioning Captain Lanfear by name as the pilot who had shot down Yamamoto. The breach of security was serious enough that Major John Mitchell's nomination for the Medal of Honor was downgraded to the Navy Cross, as were the awards for all the pilots involved. The question of who actually shot down Yamamoto's bomber would become one of the most contentious debates in military aviation history. Lanfear claimed credit immediately, and his story was initially accepted. But as the years passed and other pilots reviewed the evidence, inconsistencies appeared in Lanfear's account. Rex Barber maintained that he had shot down the bomber carrying Yamamoto, and that Lanfear had been engaged with Zeros at the critical moment. Japanese eyewitness accounts, particularly from Zero pilot Kenji Yanagiya, who had been part of the escort, supported Barber's version. Modern historians, after reviewing all available evidence, generally credit Barber with both bomber kills, though the official record remains ambiguous. For the Japanese, the loss of Yamamoto was a devastating blow. The admiral's body was cremated according to Japanese custom, and his ashes returned to Tokyo. The announcement of his death, released on May 21, 1943, over a month after the actual event, was met with shock and grief throughout Japan. Yamamoto had been more than a military commander. He was a symbol of Japanese naval power, a living connection to the great victory at Tsushima in 1904, where he had fought and been wounded as a young officer. His death was treated almost as a state funeral, with ceremonies across the nation. Admiral Menichi Koga replaced Yamamoto as commander of the combined fleet, but he was not Yamamoto, and he knew it. Koga himself acknowledged this, reportedly stating, "There was only one Yamamoto, and no one can replace him." The new commander brought a more conservative, cautious approach to naval operations. in stark contrast to Yamamoto's aggressive, decisive style. Whether this shift resulted from Koga's personality or from the deteriorating strategic situation Japan faced in mid-1943 is debatable. What is certain is that after Yamamoto's death, Japan never again won a major naval engagement in the Pacific. The tide had already turned at Midway, but the loss of Yamamoto accelerated Japan's defensive posture. For the American pilots who flew the mission, and for the P-38 Lightning itself, Operation Vengeance became a defining moment. The mission demonstrated capabilities that many had doubted: extreme range precision navigation, coordinated strike execution, and the ability to project power far beyond what the enemy believed possible. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked for its twin engines and unconventional design had just executed the longest fighter interception mission in history, flying over 400 miles one way to strike with surgical precision and return home safely. The P-38's reputation in the Pacific solidified after Operation Vengeance. The twin-boom fighter became the preferred mount of the theater's top aces. Richard Bong would eventually achieve 40 confirmed aerial victories, all in P-38's, becoming America's highest-scoring ace of the entire war. Thomas Maguire reached 38 victories before his death in combat in January 1945, also flying Lightnings. The aircraft's combination of range, firepower, and twin-engine reliability made it ideally suited for the vast expanses of the Pacific, where missions routinely covered distances that would have been impossible for single-engine fighters. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, flew combat missions in P-38's in the Pacific in 1944 as a civilian technical advisor. At 52 years old, far past the age for combat flying, Lindbergh taught fighter pilots how to extend the P-38's range even further through careful fuel management techniques. His expertise in long-distance flight, honed during his solo Atlantic crossing in 1927, translated directly to combat operations. Under Lindbergh's tutelage, P-38 pilots learned fuel mixtures, adjust propeller pitch, and throttle back engines in ways that stretched their combat radius to previously unthinkable distances. By the end of the war, over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings had been built. They flew more than 130,000 missions in every theater of combat. P-38 pilots shot down more Japanese aircraft than pilots flying any other American fighter type. As reconnaissance aircraft, the unarmed F-4 and F-5 variants with cameras replacing guns, P-38's captured an estimated 90% of all aerial reconnaissance photographs taken over Europe. The intelligence these photos provided was crucial for planning operations ranging from the strategic bombing campaign to the D-Day landings. This P-38's service record included some of the most remarkable achievements of the air war. It was the first American fighter to shoot down a German aircraft in the war. It was the only American fighter in continuous production from before Pearl Harbor until VJ Day. It was the first fighter to encounter the phenomenon of compressibility, pushing the boundaries of transonic flight. And it executed Operation Vengeance, the mission that eliminated one of America's most formidable adversaries. Yet the Lightning never quite achieved the iconic status of the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt in American popular memory. Part of this stems from its mixed record in Europe, where early models struggled at high altitude, and where the Mustang's superior high-altitude performance eventually displaced it from the bomber escort role. Part of it stems from the aircraft's complexity, which made it less accessible to average pilots than simpler single-engine designs. And part of it stems from simple aesthetics. The P-51 looked like what people thought a fighter should look like, sleek and conventional, while the P-38 looked strange, different, wrong. But to the men who flew it successfully and to the enemies who faced it in combat, the P-38 Lightning was anything but wrong. German pilots who had initially dismissed it learned to fear it, Japanese pilots who encountered it over the Pacific knew they faced an aircraft that could outrange them, outgun them, and, in the hands of a skilled pilot, outmaneuver them. The twin engines that seemed like a liability proved to be a lifesaver, bringing damaged aircraft and wounded pilots home across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Johannes Steinhoff, the Luftwaffe commander who had fought P-38's over North Africa, survived the war to become one of Germany's senior military leaders in the post-war era. In interviews late in his life, he reflected on the Lightning with a mixture of professional respect and personal wariness. Yes, the Bf-109 was perhaps a little faster in level flight. Yes, German fighters could sometimes outclimb it at certain altitudes. But engaging a P-38 flown by a competent pilot was, in Steinhoff's words, daunting. The tight turning radius, the rapid transition from level flight to climb, the devastating concentrated firepower, all of it made the Lightning a dangerous opponent that demanded respect, not mockery. Franz Stigler, the Luftwaffe ace who had laid down the cardinal rule about never fighting a P-38 head-on, expressed similar sentiments. The Lightning could turn inside the Bf-109 with ease, he recalled. It could use its power and maneuverability in ways that defied German tactical doctrine. Pilots who tried to make head-on attacks or attempted to follow a Lightning into a vertical climb paid for their mistakes with their lives. The aircraft that looked ungainly on the ground became graceful and lethal in the hands of pilots who understood how to exploit its unique characteristics. The mockery that German pilots had expressed when they first encountered the P-38 had been based on preconceptions about what a fighter should be. Those preconceptions assumed that twin engines meant sluggish handling. They assumed that size meant poor maneuverability. They assumed that unconventional design meant inferior performance. All of those assumptions proved wrong when tested against reality. The P-38 was different, but different did not mean inferior. It meant optimized for different missions, different tactics, different theaters of war. And on the morning of April 18, 1943, that difference had allowed 16 American pilots to fly 400 miles across open ocean, intercept the most important target in the Pacific theater with minute precision timing, eliminate that target, and return home safely. The mission had required an aircraft with exceptional range, twin-engine reliability, heavy firepower, and the performance to fight and win against elite Japanese fighter pilots. Only one aircraft in the American arsenal could meet all those requirements. The Germans had laughed at its twin engines. The Japanese had paid for underestimating what those twin engines enabled. The P-38 Lightning's legacy extends beyond its combat record. It represented a willingness to think differently, to reject conventional wisdom when conventional approaches could not meet requirements. Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed had been told that the Army's specifications were impossible. They had responded by designing an aircraft that looked like nothing else in the sky. That willingness to innovate, to accept complexity in service of capability, would become a hallmark of American aircraft design in the decades that followed. The mission that eliminated Yamamoto remained partially classified for years, with full details emerging only gradually as wartime secrecy restrictions were lifted. But among Pacific War veterans, the story was known and retold. It became a touchstone, an example of what was possible when intelligence, planning, and execution aligned perfectly. The navigational precision, the fuel management, the split-second decisions in combat. All of it came together in a way that seemed almost impossible. And yet, it had happened. For Rex Barber, who most historians now credit with shooting down Yamamoto's bomber, the mission was eventually recognized with the Navy Cross, though the full extent of his achievement would not be acknowledged until decades after the war. The aircraft he flew that day, Miss Virginia, returned to Henderson Field with over 100 bullet holes from zero gunfire, testament to the violence of the engagement. That P-38 had been borrowed from Lieutenant Robert Petit for the mission. Petit himself had used that same aircraft to shoot down 2 Japanese floatplane fighters in February and to damage a submarine chaser in March. The Lightning served multiple pilots, multiple missions, accumulating a combat record that spoke to its durability and versatility. Major John Mitchell, whose navigation had been so precise that the formation arrived at the interception point within 1 minute of the calculated time after flying over 600 miles by dead reckoning, never received the Medal of Honor that had been recommended. The security breach that led to premature publicity about the mission resulted in all awards being downgraded. But Mitchell's achievement stands regardless of decorations. Navigating across featureless ocean using only a compass, watch, and calculations, arriving exactly on time, and bringing 15 of 16 aircraft home safely represents piloting and leadership of the highest order. The story of the P-38 Lightning from German mockery in North Africa to the successful execution of Operation Vengeance illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare. Capability matters more than appearance, and results matter more than preconceptions. The aircraft looked strange. It was complex. It demanded skilled pilots and careful maintenance. But when the mission required range, power, and firepower beyond what any other fighter could provide, the P-38 delivered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who had warned his own government that Japan could not win a protracted war against American industrial might, was killed by an aircraft that embodied that industrial might. The P-38 was expensive, roughly $120,000 per aircraft, twice the cost of most single-engine fighters. It was complex, requiring sophisticated turbocharged engines and intricate systems. It was different, violating conventional wisdom about fighter design. But the United States could afford to build 10,000 of them, could train pilots to fly them, and could project power across 400 miles of ocean to eliminate threats with surgical precision. The Germans had laughed at the P-38's twin engines. They had dismissed its unconventional design. And then they had learned to fear the Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, as it struck from unexpected angles with devastating firepower. The Japanese had believed their forward bases were beyond American reach, and then P-38's had appeared over Bougainville, 400 miles from the nearest Allied airfield, arriving precisely on schedule to execute the most important fighter mission of the Pacific War. In the end, the P-38 Lightning proved that innovation requires courage, the courage to design differently, to build differently, to fight differently. The aircraft that didn't look right, that violated the conventional wisdom of single-engine fighter doctrine, became the tool that accomplished what conventional fighters could not. It brought American pilots home across thousands of miles of ocean. It destroyed enemy aircraft by the thousands. And on one April morning in 1943, it changed the course of the Pacific War by eliminating the one Japanese admiral who could not be replaced. The twin engines the Germans had mocked became the redundancy that saved lives. The size they had criticized became the range that enabled impossible missions. The unconventional design they had dismissed became the platform for America's highest-scoring aces. The P-38 Lightning, strange, complex, different, was exactly what the war required. And 400 miles from Guadalcanal, in the jungle of Bougainville, the wreckage of a Mitsubishi Betty bomber stood as testament to what that difference could achieve. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.